She left behind almost nothing. A trunk. A quilt her grandmother had pieced together from dress scraps before the war. A Bible with a man's name written on the inside cover in ink so old it had gone to gray. And tucked beneath all of it, small enough to hide in a coat pocket, a diary bound in dark calfskin with a brass clasp that had turned green at the edges from years of handling. Her granddaughter found it in 1921, in the back room of a farmhouse in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. She opened it expecting recipes, or scripture, or the kind of daily accounting women of that generation kept out of habit. What she found instead was something she was not prepared for. A record of 2,000 miles, written in a hand that started careful and grew rawer as the months went on, as though the woman doing the writing had slowly run out of patience for her own restraint. Most of the entries were short. Weather, miles, the names of the dead. But there was one, dated August the 29th, 1853, that her granddaughter read 4 times before she could set the book down. Today a man I barely knew carried me across the Snake River on his back. I told him not to. He carried me anyway. I do not know what to make of a man like that. I am not certain I have ever known one. That was all. No explanation of who he was. No account of what happened after. Just the river, and the man, and the fact of being carried by someone who had not asked permission and had not expected thanks. Her name was Ruth Calloway. She was 32 years old when she stepped onto the Oregon Trail in the first week of May, 1853, and she was carrying something heavier than her trunk, heavier than the flour sack and the cast iron pot and the grandmother's quilt folded on top of everything else. She was carrying a quiet, grinding certainty that she was going to be more trouble than she was worth, that sooner or later, on some mile of that 2,000-mile road, someone was going to say so to her face. She had been waiting for that moment for most of her life. She had spent most of her life making sure it never came. This is the story of what happened instead. Ruth had not planned to go west. That much should be said first, because there is a version of this kind of story where a woman heads for the frontier with fire in her eyes and a dream in her chest and the whole wide world laid out before her like a gift. That was not Ruth's story. Ruth went west because the life she had was finished, and west was the only direction with anything left in it. She had lived in a town called Millbrook in eastern Ohio for the better part of her adult life, married to a man named Daniel Calloway who worked the mill and was by every account a decent and steady man. He loved her without drama and without complaint, and died in December of 1851 beside the fence post where he had gone to break the ice off the water trough, his heart stopping in the cold without warning, as though it had simply decided it had done enough. Ruth was 30 years old and childless and suddenly a woman with a name that belonged to a man who was gone, and she spent that winter learning what it meant to exist in a town where everyone knew her face and no one knew what to do with it anymore. The sympathy came first, then the practical suggestions, then the silence, which was the worst of the three. Her sister Margaret had gone west the year before, with a husband named Caleb Dowd who had talked about Oregon since the day he learned the word. They had sent 2 letters back, once from Fort Laramie, once from Oregon City, where they had staked a claim in the Willamette Valley and were already pulling stumps and clearing ground. The letters were short and practical, the way Margaret had always been. But the last line of the second one stayed with Ruth through the whole winter. "There is room here. There is room for you here." She read that sentence many times. She was not sure it was an invitation so much as a fact Margaret had decided she needed to know. She sold the house in March of 1853. She sold the furniture, the mill equipment, the chickens, everything except the trunk of clothes, the grandmother's quilt, Daniel's Bible, and the small calfskin diary she had kept since she was a girl. She paid her passage on a wagon train out of Independence with what was left, and she stood on the bank of the Missouri River on the first day of May and looked west at a horizon that told her nothing at all. She had never thought of herself as brave. She had only ever been out of options. Now, before the story moves forward, there is something that needs to be said about Ruth Calloway's leg, because the leg is not incidental to this story. The leg is, in many ways, the whole story. She had fallen from a horse at age 12 on her father's farm in Pennsylvania. A bad fall onto rocky ground that broke something below the knee in a way the doctor could set but could not quite fix. She healed. She walked. She had walked every day of her life since and never once asked for a cane. But she walked with a gait that strangers noticed, a slight favoring of the left, a careful way of reading the ground 2 steps ahead of her feet, a habit of moving slowly over uneven terrain that on a farm or on a town street was merely an inconvenience, and on the Oregon Trail, 2,000 miles of mud and rock and river crossing and mountain pass, was something that could get a woman left behind. She knew this going in. She had known it since she paid her fare, and she had said nothing to anyone, because saying it would have made it real in a way she could not afford. She simply intended to keep up. She had kept up her whole life. She saw no reason to stop. The wagon train was captained by a man named Ira Birch, 53 years old, square-jawed, weathered the way men get who have spent their lives outdoors and stop noticing it. He had made the Oregon crossing 4 times and wore that fact the way some men wear a scar. He was not unkind. He was also not patient with anything that slowed the column, because in his experience, slowness in August meant snow in the Blue Mountains in October, and snow in the Blue Mountains in October could kill everyone in the train. He had seen it. He did not intend to see it again. There were 31 wagons in the train, and Ruth traveled in number 19, sharing a rig with a widow named Mrs. Hartley and her adult daughter, who passed the hours in a state of low, continuous argument about things Ruth could not always identify. Ruth kept her trunk behind the seat and wrote in the diary each evening by firelight and was grateful, mostly, not to be alone. The first weeks were beautiful in the way that exhausting things are beautiful when you are too tired to be afraid. The Platte River Valley opened up in late May, wide, flat, brown-green, smelling of river mud and sage, and Ruth walked beside the wagon on the good days and rode inside on the bad ones and watched the prairie roll past like something that had been waiting a long time for someone to cross it. Chimney Rock appeared on a Thursday morning in early June, rising 300 feet out of the flat Nebraska plain with no explanation for itself, pale and improbable and somehow exactly what she had needed to see, proof that the world still had the capacity to surprise her. She was keeping up. Her leg ached by evening and she rubbed it with lard and wrapped it in a strip of flannel and went to sleep and woke before the others each morning and was already walking when the wagons began to move. She did not limp where anyone could see her. She had learned that much. It was outside Fort Laramie, at mile 470, that she first spoke to Thomas Hale. He was in wagon 22, traveling with his younger brother Eli, and Eli's wife Clara, and their 3 children, the oldest of whom was 7. Thomas drove the second wagon, handled the oxen, and fixed what broke, which on the Oregon Trail was constant work that left little room for anything else. He was broad-shouldered and spare with words and had a face that you looked at and thought, he has worked outdoors his whole life, and then forgot. He fixed a wheel on Mrs. Hartley's wagon on a hot afternoon in June, kneeling in the dust without being asked, and when he was done, Ruth thanked him on Mrs. Hartley's behalf. He nodded once. That was the whole of the exchange. She thought nothing of it. Fort Laramie gave them 2 days of rest, and Ruth used them to trade a pair of wool stockings she would not need in Oregon for a tin of lard and a new pair of bootlaces, and she stood at the edge of the fort and looked at the mountains for the first time in her life, the Laramie Range, pale and serrated against the sky, and felt something she did not have a word for. Not fear and not hope, something in between, like standing at the edge of a thing before you know what it costs. She wrote that evening, "The mountains look like something that will require more of me than I have. I suppose I will find out if that is true." She would find out sooner than she expected. South Pass came on a Thursday in early July, at 7,400 feet elevation, at mile 947 by Captain Birch's reckoning. The pass itself was not dramatic the way Ruth had imagined. It was wide and gradual, more a high plain than a proper mountain crossing. The kind of landscape that would be merely beautiful if the wind did not come off it like a judgment. The ground was loose shale and dry grass and the kind of pale dust that found its way into everything. Your eyes, the seams of your clothing, the pages of a diary sealed inside a flour sack. Her leg gave out on the second day. Not collapsed, she would not let it collapse, but it tightened the way it did when she had pushed it too long. A deep, grinding ache that started below the knee and climbed to her hip, and she fell behind the wagon. First 10 yards, then 20, then further. By mid-afternoon she was 150 yards behind number 19 and the gap was widening and she could feel, with the part of herself she kept very quiet, that she was not going to close it on her own. Thomas appeared beside her without sound, the way large, quiet men sometimes do. He did not offer his arm. He did not slow down ostentatiously to make a point of her pace. He simply walked at the speed she walked and said, after a while, something about the color of the sky, which was, in fairness, extraordinary, a deep late afternoon blue that looked like it had been painted by someone who wanted to be sure you noticed. He said something about his brother Eli that was mildly funny. He did not look at her leg. She walked the rest of the day. By the time the wagon stopped, she was 50 yards back instead of 150, which was not nothing. She wrote that night, "A man named Hale walked with me over the pass today. I do not know why he did it. He did not make me feel watched, which I had not expected. I thanked him in a way that made clear I did not require his company. He accepted this without any sign he had noticed." She did not write what she was actually thinking, which was, "I have been so careful not to be seen as slow that I have not once considered what it would mean to let someone walk at my speed and call it company rather than charity." She did not know how to write that yet. She was not sure she was ready to. Fort Hall arrived in late July, at mile 1,320, in present-day Idaho, and it was there that the conversation Ruth had been dreading since Missouri finally happened. Captain Birch called her to the front of the column on a Tuesday evening. He was not cruel. He had the manner of a man delivering a truth he did not enjoy, which she had learned to distrust because that manner had never once spared her the truth. He said the train was behind schedule. He said the Snake River crossing was still ahead, and the Blue Mountains beyond that, and the first snows could come to the high passes as early as mid-September, and that he had watched her on the trail for 2 months. He said he thought she should consider staying at Fort Hall, wintering there, going on with a smaller party in the spring. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. The fire crackled. Someone's child was crying 3 wagons back. The air smelled of sagebrush and dust and the end of summer coming. She said, "I will be at the Snake River crossing with everyone else. Whatever happens there, I will not slow you down." Birch looked at her the way men sometimes look at women who say inconvenient things. He nodded once and walked away. Ruth went back to her wagon and sat inside with the canvas flap closed and pressed her palms flat against her knees and breathed until the anger passed. She did not cry. She had not cried since Daniel died, and she did not intend to start in Idaho over a man who was probably right. She wrote that night, "The captain thinks I am a liability. He is probably correct. I find I do not especially care what the captain thinks." She would not know until weeks later that Thomas Hale had been standing 12 feet behind her during that conversation, checking the feet of his oxen, that he had heard every word. The Snake River arrived on August the 29th at a place where the water ran wide and fast and cold over a bed of dark, smooth stones. The current was high from a wet summer in the mountains above, and when Ruth stood at the bank and looked across, she could see the trail continuing on the far side, a dusty brown line climbing away through sage and rock, and it looked to her like something she could not reach. The crossing was made in parts. Wagons floated on rafts lashed from logs. Oxen swum across. People waited in groups, holding a rope that had been strung across by the first men over. At mid-river, the water came to a tall man's chest. Ruth was not a tall man. She understood what this meant. She went in with 2 other women from the train, gripping the rope with both hands, feeling the current push against her legs with a force that was almost conversational. Not violent, just insistent, as though the river were informing her of its position on the matter. The rocks under her feet were slick with moss. She moved carefully. She made it 30 feet, perhaps 35. Her bad legs slid on something she could not see, and she went down. She came up. This she noted later with something like satisfaction. That she had not panicked, had not gone under a second time, had grabbed the rope and held on and was working to find her footing when 2 hands came from behind her, one on her upper arm and one at her waist, and Thomas Hale said directly into her ear, over the sound of the river, "Put your arms around my neck." She did not argue. The river had taken the argument out of her. He carried her the rest of the way across on his back. It was not easy. The current came at them sideways and the rocks shifted, and he went to one knee at the deepest point and came back up with a sound that was mostly breath, and when they reached the far bank he set her down on a flat rock and stepped away without ceremony and went back into the river to retrieve the rope. Ruth sat on that rock and coughed river water and looked at her hands and said nothing. She sat there long after the other wagons had crossed. She sat there watching the last of the rafts come over and thinking about a man who had not asked permission and had not made a speech about it and had gone straight back into the river when it was done. She had known men who made a great deal of very little. She was not accustomed to one who made very little of a great deal. That evening she wrote 2 sentences. Those 2 sentences: the river and the man, and the fact of not knowing what to make of him. What she did not write was that something had shifted inside her on that rock that she did not yet have a name for. Something about weight, about what it meant to be carried and not diminished by it. She had spent so long refusing help that she had confused refusal with strength, and the river had loosened something in that equation she could not quite put back the way it was. The Blue Mountains of Oregon began on the 1st of September and lasted 4 days and were the hardest 4 days of the entire crossing. The trail rose steeply through dense pine forest, Douglas fir and ponderosa, trees so tall they made the sky look small, and the wagons had to be lowered down the far slopes by ropes tied around tree trunks. A slow and nerve-stripping process that took all the rope and all the men and most of the daylight. At night the temperature dropped to something that felt like November, and Ruth slept under the grandmother's quilt and woke each morning with cold hands and stiff knees and kept going, which was all any of them were doing. Thomas walked near her wagon through the mountains, not conspicuously, not as an announcement, but near. She noticed by the 2nd day and said nothing. On the 3rd day she stopped beside a creek that crossed the trail and waited. The water ran cold and clear over small gray stones and smelled like something that had come from very high up and was in a hurry to get lower. When Thomas came along, she turned to face him. She said, "Why did you walk with me over South Pass?" He thought about it, the way he seemed to think about most things, completely, without hurry. He said, "You were going to make it either way. I thought you might as well have company." She said, "You didn't know that." He said, "No. But I thought it." She looked at him. She said, "Why did you carry me across the river?" He said, "Because you went under. And because," he stopped, started again, "because I heard what the captain said to you at Fort Hall." Ruth was quiet. Then she said, "That wasn't your business." He said, "I know it." She looked at him a long time. The creek moved past them and the pines moved above them, and somewhere high in the canopy a bird was making a sound she did not recognize, clear and unhurried, as though it had no particular concern about the people standing below it. She said, "I didn't like needing the help." He said, "I know that too." There was a pause that held more in it than most conversations she had managed in years. Then they walked the rest of the mountain together, not saying much, which turned out to be enough. Here is where the story should perhaps resolve, and here is where it does not. 4 days after the Blue Mountains, on the descent toward the Dalles, the worst of the trail was behind them. The land softened, the air warmed. People in the wagon train started laughing again in the evenings. Ruth's leg was sore but manageable, and she could feel, for the first time since Missouri, that the end was a real place she was going to reach. Thomas had been quieter since the creek in the mountains. She noticed it the first day, the way he walked his wagon a little further from hers, the way he answered in fewer words when they spoke. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself with some firmness. His brother Eli came to her wagon on the 3rd evening. He was not a bad man. He said so himself at the beginning, which Ruth found was never a reassuring way to open a conversation. He said Thomas had spoken to him about filing for a land claim near the Dowd homestead in the Willamette Valley, near her sister's place. He said he had 3 children and a wife and had not made this crossing to have things complicated by something nobody had put a name to yet. And he wanted to know, he said not unkindly, what Ruth's intentions were. She said, "I have no intentions, Mr. Hale. I am going to my sister." Eli nodded and left. Ruth sat in the dark wagon and felt something she recognized as grief, though it was not for anything she had possessed. She had been careful, she thought. She had been so careful. She had thanked him without warmth at the river, and disagreed with him at the creek, and kept a distance she was not sure she had wanted to keep. And here was grief anyway, settling around her in the dark like it had been waiting for her to sit still long enough to find her. She wrote that night, "A man's brother came tonight to ask about intentions. I said I had none. This was the truth. I am not certain it will remain the truth, and I do not know what to do with that uncertainty except carry it, which I have had some practice at." She made a decision before morning. She would say nothing. The river was the river and the mountains were the mountains, and a man who carried you across a river did not owe you anything more than that, and she did not intend to become a woman who confused a kindness for a promise. She had made harder decisions. She would keep this one. Oregon City appeared on the 21st of September, after a descent through forests of fir and cedar so thick they held a greenish light inside them, cool and dim, like something out of a cathedral. The wagons came down through the last of the trees, and the Willamette Valley opened below them, wide, green, still, impossibly green after 5 months of dust and rock and pale scrubland, and Ruth stood at the overlook and could not find words for what she felt. She had set out in May with a trunk she could barely lift and a leg that had never worked right, and a fear she had never once said aloud. And she was standing on a hillside in Oregon. She had not done it alone. She had carried others where she could and been carried where she could not, and she was here, on this hill, looking at this valley, and the feeling that came with that was not triumph exactly. It was something quieter, The feeling of having underestimated yourself for a very long time and being finally, reluctantly proven wrong. Thomas stood beside her. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I told Eli I was sorry for what he said to you." Ruth said nothing. He said, "I am going to put in for a claim in the valley. There is land near the Dowd homestead." She said, "I know." He said, "I am not asking you anything." She said, "I know that too." They stood together at the overlook, and the valley lay below them, and the Willamette River ran silver through the green, and the air smelled of rain coming down from the mountains and pine and something else that had no name. The smell, maybe, of a place that had not yet asked everything of you, that had something left to give. After a while she said, "You were right. At the creek in the mountains." He looked at her. She said, "I was going to make it either way. But the company helped." He said, very quietly, "I thought it might." Her sister Margaret came out to meet the wagons on the road into Oregon City, having ridden when the train was spotted on the hillside, and the two women stood in the middle of the road and held each other without speaking. Margaret had cut her hair short, and her hands were rougher than Ruth remembered, and she looked like someone who had become more of herself out here than she had ever been in Ohio. Ruth thought she understood that now in a way she had not when she left. Thomas Hale filed his land claim in October of 1853. His parcel sat 1.5 miles from the Dowd homestead, on a piece of ground that ran along a creek and had good soil and 2 stands of fir that would build a house once he got them down. He spent the fall clearing and the winter building, and he came to Sunday supper at the Dowd place every week or two, and sat at the table with his hat in his lap, and talked with Caleb about spring planting and the price of seed, and whether the creek would flood in March. He did not say anything to Ruth that he had not said on the trail. He sat where he could see her across the table. She sat where she could see him. Margaret noticed this the way older sisters notice things, completely and without comment, which was its own form of communication. In February of 1854, on an afternoon when rain was coming sideways off the mountains and the Willamette had gone the color of iron, Thomas came to the Dowd house and asked to speak with Ruth privately. She put on her coat and went out to the porch with him, and whatever passed between them in the cold and the rain that afternoon, neither of them ever wrote down. What Ruth wrote that evening, in the last pages of the small calfskin diary with the green-edged clasp, filling the final lines of the final page as though she had measured it out from the beginning and was only now arriving at the place the whole book had been pointing toward, was this: "I set out from Missouri in the belief that I would be more burden than I was worth. I arrived in Oregon having been carried across a river by a man who did not hold that opinion. I spent 6 months deciding whether to trust his judgment over my own. I have decided to trust his judgment. His name is Thomas Hale. He has good hands and a quiet way, and he does not make a ceremony of kindness, which I have come to believe is the rarest and most valuable thing in a person. I think I knew something of this at the Snake River, and was too frightened to look at it directly. 2,000 miles is a long way to travel to learn what you already believed. It was worth every step." She kept the diary for the rest of her life. She never filled another one, though she lived 43 more years, raised 4 children in the Willamette Valley, and is buried as she requested on the high ground behind the house where the creek bends and you can see the mountains on a clear day. Her granddaughter found it in 1921, beneath the quilt and the gloves. She read those last paragraphs 4 times. Then she set the book down on the table and looked out the window at the valley her great-great-grandmother had walked 2,000 miles to reach. And she thought about a woman who had been afraid her whole life of being a burden, and a man who had carried her without being asked, and the long and ordinary and extraordinary life they had built on the other side of a river. Outside, the Willamette Valley was green in the way it is always green out there. Quietly, without requiring anything of you. Ruth Calloway Hale had not required anything of it either. She had only asked for room, and there had been room enough.